I can tell you with certainty that after 18 years, Natalie's case is solved.
In May 2005, 18-year-old Natalee Holloway vanished on what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, her high school graduation getaway to Aruba. One moment, she was laughing with friends under the Caribbean moonlight. The next, she was gone without a trace. No body, no answers. Just a trail of questions that would torment her family and captivate the world for nearly 2 decades. For years, investigators chased dead ends. Her parents begged for answers, and the name Natalee Holloway became synonymous with unsolved tragedy. It was the kind of case that felt cursed. Every lead fizzled, every theory collapsed, and the truth stayed buried. But now, almost 20 years later, that truth has finally clawed its way to the surface. And while it offers the closure her family has been aching for, the details are darker, more chilling, and more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Natalee Holloway's disappearance. What began as a dream vacation quickly unraveled into every parent's worst nightmare. Natalee Holloway, the bright straight-A senior from Alabama's Mountain Brook High School, landed in Aruba with 124 of her classmates in late May 2005. It was supposed to be 5 days of freedom, sunburnt afternoons, all-night dancing, and that sweet taste of adulthood that comes right before college. 7 chaperones tagged along, but their role was loose. They checked in on the students each day, just enough to keep a watchful eye without shadowing their every move. The truth was, these teenagers were cut loose on an island that ran on rum, music, and reckless abandon. Even investigators would later describe the trip as a blur of wild partying, a lot of drinking, lots of room switching every night. The Holiday Inn where the group stayed even decided they wouldn't welcome the students back the following year. Natalee, by several accounts, dove headfirst into the chaos. Witnesses claimed she drank heavily, sometimes starting her mornings with cocktails, sometimes skipping breakfast altogether. 2 of her classmates admitted the drinking was kind of excessive, but in the swirl of Caribbean nights, she was just another teenager chasing one last thrill before real life began. Then came the night that changed everything. In the early hours of Monday, May 30th, Natalee was spotted for the last time. Around 1:30 a.m., she left Carlos and Charlie's, a buzzing nightclub in Oranjestad, slipping into a car with 17-year-old Joran van der Sloot, a Dutch honors student who lived on the island, and his 2 friends, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. She was supposed to board a flight home just hours later. Instead, her seat remained empty. Her neatly packed suitcase and passport were still sitting in her Holiday Inn room, as if waiting for her to return. But Natalee never walked back through those doors. The island turned upside down. Search teams combed Aruba's beaches, its back roads, and its waters. Police and volunteers scoured every corner. Yet there was no body, no trace, nothing that explained how an ordinary night had dissolved into silence. Background on Natalee Holloway. Before she became a headline, Natalee Holloway was just a girl with her whole future mapped out. Born in Memphis, Tennessee, she was the first child of Dave and Beth Holloway. When her parents divorced in 1993, Natalee and her younger brother Matthew stayed with their mother in Clinton, Mississippi, where Beth did her best to hold everything together. Life shifted again in 2000, when Beth remarried George "Jug" Twitty, a well-known Alabama businessman. With that came a new start in Mountain Brook, Alabama, a wealthy suburb just outside Birmingham, where the family settled into a life of comfort and privilege. It was the kind of community where expectations ran high, and Natalee lived up to every single one. She wasn't just smart, she was driven. By the time she graduated in May 2005, she had honors stitched to her name, a spot in the National Honor Society, and a reputation as the girl who seemed to do it all. She danced on the school squad, threw herself into extracurriculars, and already had her next chapter lined up. A full scholarship to the University of Alabama was waiting for her, where she planned to take the pre-med track. Her parents were proud. Her father, Dave, worked as an insurance agent in Mississippi, while Beth taught in the Mountain Brook school system. Both believed their daughter was on the edge of something extraordinary. Natalee had the brains, the discipline, and the heart. It felt like the world was opening its arms to her. But within weeks of that proud graduation day, the promise of her future would vanish into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions, heartbreak, and the haunting shadow of what might have been. early investigations, and the arrests of Joran van der Sloot and the Calpo brothers. The moment Natalee Holloway missed her flight home, her mother knew something was wrong. Beth and her husband Jug didn't wait for answers to come to them. They chartered a private jet and were on the ground in Aruba within hours. By the time they landed, they already had a name: Joran van der Sloot, the teenager last seen with Natalie outside the nightclub. Beth claimed she got his full name from the Holiday Inn's night manager, who thought he recognized him on security footage. Armed with that information, the Twitties marched straight to the van der Sloot home, bringing 2 Aruban police officers along. Face to face, Joran first denied even knowing Natalie. Then, under pressure, he spun a story that matched his friend Deepak Kalpo's version. Natalie had asked to see sharks, so they drove her to the California lighthouse near Arashi Beach. Later, they claimed, they dropped her at the Holiday Inn around 2 a.m. Joran added one eerie detail: that Natalie stumbled as she got out of the car, but refused his help. As they pulled away, he insisted she was approached by a man dressed like a hotel security guard. The search for Natalie began almost immediately. Aruba itself seemed to grind to a halt. Hundreds of locals and Americans joined in, combing the island's beaches, waters, and back roads. The government even gave thousands of civil servants the day off to help. Dutch Marines swept the shoreline. Banks raised money. Volunteers kept the effort alive. Beth Holloway, meanwhile, stayed first in the very Holiday Inn room her daughter had occupied, and later in the presidential suite of a nearby hotel, as she refused to give up on finding her child. Security cameras should have offered clarity, but reports about whether they were working the night Natalie vanished were inconsistent. In her own accounts, Beth gave conflicting statements over the years, sometimes saying the cameras were down, other times claiming they were functional. Either way, Natalie never appeared on any footage. Police later pointed out she may not have needed to pass through the lobby to get back to her room, which left even more uncertainty hanging in the air. For weeks, every possible lead was chased down, only to collapse into nothing. A suspicious stain in Deepak's car turned out not to be blood. Rumors flared and fizzled. Even the U.S. government weighed in, with officials assuring the Holloways that American law enforcement was working closely with Aruba every step of the way. Then came the arrests. On June 5th, police picked up 2 security guards, Nick John and Abraham Jones, from a nearby hotel that had been shut down for renovations. Their reputation for harassing women made them convenient suspects. But just over a week later, they were released without charges. Days later, the focus shifted back to the trio everyone had been watching from the start: Joran van der Sloot and the Calpo brothers. On June 9th, all 3 were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. Investigators had been quietly tracking them for days, monitoring their phones, their emails, even following them on the streets. But under mounting pressure from Natalie's family, police broke cover and moved in sooner than they planned. The case spiraled from there. On June 11th, a government spokesman wrongly declared that Natalie was dead and that authorities knew where her body was. Hours later, he walked it back, blaming a misinformation campaign. That same night, the police commissioner hinted that one of the suspects had confessed that something bad happened to Natalie on the beach and was ready to lead them to the spot. But by the next morning, prosecutors refused to confirm it. The story dangled in the air, half true, half denied, and wholly disturbing. By June 17th, another man was caught in the net, a disc jockey named Steve Crows, arrested because of something one of the 3 suspects said. Days later, even Joran's father, Paulus van der Sloot, was hauled in. But neither man stayed locked up for long. Both were released before the month was over. The real cracks began to show in the suspects' stories. First, they claimed to have dropped Natalie at her hotel. Then they said they left her on the beach near the Marriott. Later, Joran tried to flip the script, claiming he was dropped at home and that the Calpos drove off with her. Investigators dismissed it as a desperate attempt to throw his friends under the bus once he realized they were pointing fingers at him. In court, the contradictions played out like a bad drama. One judge noted the obvious: their stories didn't match. By early July, the Calpo brothers were released. Joran, however, was ordered to stay behind bars for another 60 days. But still, no Natalie, no body, no solid evidence. Just shifting lies, broken promises, and a family caught in the middle of a nightmare with no end in sight. Theories surrounding Natalie's disappearance. By July, the search for Natalee Holloway had stretched into the impossible. Aruba was small, 20 miles long, 6 miles wide, yet she had vanished, as if the island itself had swallowed her whole. Desperate for answers, authorities called in help from the Dutch military. On July 4th, 3 F-16 fighter jets, armed with infrared sensors, swept across the island skies. If Natalie's body had been buried, the heat signatures should have betrayed it. But the results came back empty. Rumors fueled new searches. A local gardener came forward claiming he had seen Joran van der Sloot with the Calpo brothers driving into the Aruba Racket Club in the early hours of May 30th, with Joran hiding his face. Jug Twitty believed this was the breakthrough. Commentators like Nancy Grace called it the testimony that could crack the case wide open. Acting on the lead, investigators drained a pond near the club at the end of July. Hours of muddy work led to nothing. Another witness, a jogger, claimed he had seen men burying a blonde woman in a landfill on the afternoon of May 30th. Authorities had already combed through that landfill once. After the jogger spoke up, they searched it 3 more times, this time with FBI cadaver dogs. Still nothing. As hope dimmed, the Holloway family raised the stakes. They first offered $175,000 for Natalie's safe return, with donors adding another $50,000. When the weeks dragged into months, the reward skyrocketed. $1 million for her safe return, $250,000 just for her remains. The money didn't bring answers. Investigators pushed forward anyway. A piece of duct tape with blonde hair was tested in the Netherlands, then retested at the FBI's Quantico labs. For a moment, it seemed like the breakthrough everyone was waiting for. But the tests confirmed the hair wasn't Natalie's, another dead end. On August 26th, police tried again. They rearrested the Calpo brothers and brought in a new suspect, 21-year-old Freddie Arambatzis, a friend of Joran's. Freddie's lawyer claimed the arrest had nothing to do with Natalie, but with allegations that he had inappropriate contact with an underage girl months earlier, with Joran and the Calpos somehow connected. Joran's mother, Anita, dismissed it as nothing more than a desperate ploy to squeeze confessions out of the boys. By September 3rd, even that tactic had collapsed. A judge ordered all 4 suspects released. Less than 2 weeks later, all restrictions were lifted. They were free. Joran, however, didn't fade quietly into the background. He started giving interviews, long, self-serving stories where he twisted details but never gave up the truth. In one of his most infamous accounts, broadcast over 3 nights on Fox News, he claimed Natalie wanted to have with him, but he refused because he didn't have a condom. He insisted she wanted to stay on the beach, but he had school the next morning, so Sadish picked him up around 3 a.m., leaving Natalie behind. He admitted he had lied at first out of embarrassment, saying he figured she would turn up soon and didn't want to get caught in a scandal. Sadish's attorney pushed back, pointing out his client had gone to bed and never returned that night to drive Joran anywhere. Still, Joran stuck to his story, even as it shifted with every retelling. Searches continued into 2006. Sweeps of sand dunes, beaches near the Marriott, stretches of Aruba's northwest coast, but they all came up empty. By this time, the case had drained Aruba financially and emotionally. Police Commissioner Gerald Dompig, just before stepping away from the case, gave his own unsettling theory. He suggested Natalie had not been murdered at all, but had died from alcohol or drugs, and that her body had been hidden afterward. He even hinted there was evidence she had possessed illicit drugs during the trip. Natalie's family furiously denied it, refusing to let the narrative smear her memory. Through it all, her parents never stopped pushing. In April 2006, Natalie's father, Dave Holloway, published Aruba, the tragic untold story of Natalee Holloway and corruption in paradise. The book laid bare his grief, his frustration, and his deep distrust of how the investigation had been handled on the island. By then, Natalie had been gone nearly a year. The reward money had grown, the suspects had changed their stories over and over, and the search stretched across landfills, ponds, dunes, and beaches. Yet the only constant was the same chilling reality: no Natalie. A jarring confession. By 2006, the case had become a carousel of arrests and releases, faces in handcuffs, names in headlines, and still no Natalie. On April 15th, authorities arrested 19-year-old Jeffrey Van Kromvoort, a young man suspected of drug dealing, possibly tied to Natalie's disappearance. His detention lasted just over a week before he was quietly released. A week later, another suspect, identified only as AB, was hauled in and let go the very same day. Then came Guido Wever, son of a former Aruban politician, detained in the Netherlands on suspicion of helping abduct and kill Natalie. 6 days of questioning led nowhere. One by one, the suspects were swallowed back into the world, leaving nothing but more shadows behind them. It soon became clear that Aruba was losing control. The Netherlands formally stepped in, taking over the investigation and sending a Dutch national police team to dig through the mountain of evidence. By April 2007, a joint Dutch-Aruban task force was on the island, determined to find what everyone else had missed. Meanwhile, Joran van der Sloot, never one to disappear from the spotlight, published a book with reporter Zvezdana Vukojevic, De Zaak Natalee Holloway, The Case of Natalee Holloway. In it, he apologized for lying but still clung to his innocence. To many, it read less like a confession and more like a performance, a young man rewriting the story to keep himself at the center of it. Investigators weren't finished with him. On April 27, 2007, they launched a surprise search at the van der Sloot family home. Shovels hit the dirt in the yard, thin rods pierced the soil, and investigators carried away computers and diaries. But once again, nothing incriminating surfaced. 2 weeks later, the Calpo brothers' home was searched as well, though the raid produced no results. That fall, though, the pressure returned. On November 21, 2007, nearly 2.5 years after Natalie vanished, Aruban authorities dropped a bombshell. Citing newly discovered evidence, they rearrested Joran van der Sloot and the Calpo brothers. This time the charges were serious: manslaughter and causing serious bodily harm leading to Natalie's death. Joran was picked up in the Netherlands and extradited back to Aruba. The Calpos were detained on the island. For a brief moment, it felt like justice was finally within reach. Natalie's father even funded an ambitious new sea search, sending a vessel called Persistence into waters deeper than previous expeditions. The hunt stretched into early 2008, but ended the way so many had before, empty-handed and drained of money. By December, the walls crumbled again. Judges ordered the release of the Calpos, ruling the case file lacked direct evidence of a violent crime. Days later, Joran himself walked free. On December 18th, prosecutors officially declared the case closed. No charges, no trial, no Natalie. But then, just as the world was beginning to look away, a new player entered the scene. Dutch crime reporter Peter R. de Vries announced he had solved the Holloway case. His February 2008 broadcast sent shockwaves across Europe and America. Hidden camera footage showed Joran, high on marijuana, casually recounting how Natalie had suddenly convulsed and collapsed in his presence. He claimed he panicked, called a friend, and that friend disposed of her body. It was the closest thing to a confession anyone had ever heard. But even this revelation unraveled. The so-called friend denied the story entirely, saying he wasn't even on the island at the time. A judge refused to grant an arrest warrant, citing inconsistencies. Once again, Joran escaped. The cycle continued. In a 2008 Fox News interview, Joran spun a darker tale, this time alleging he had sold Natalie slavery and that his father had paid off police to cover it up. He later admitted it was all a lie. Each story contradicted the last, a grotesque carousel of versions that kept the Holloway family trapped in fresh torment. By 2009, Dave Holloway was personally funding new searches, even flying in a search dog to comb reservoirs for his daughter's remains. Nothing. In 2010, Joran threw out yet another version, that he had dumped Natalie's body in a marsh. Authorities investigated and dismissed it. His timeline and details didn't add up. Later that spring, an American couple snorkeling off Aruba claimed they had found what looked like human remains underwater. Investigators dove the area. Again, nothing. At every turn, the truth seemed just within reach, only to dissolve in a cloud of lies, false confessions, and empty searches. A twist no one saw coming. By 2010, the Holloway case had turned into something out of a twisted crime novel. Except it was all real, all raw, and still without answers. And right at the center of it all was Joran van der Sloot, the name that had become synonymous with lies, manipulation, and a chilling lack of remorse. On March 29th, van der Sloot dangled what he claimed was the truth in front of Beth Holloway's lawyer, the location of Natalie's body. But it came with a price tag, $250,000, with $25,000 up front. It was extortion wrapped in false hope. The FBI got involved, wired the cash, tracked the transfer, and watched Vandersloot spin another cruel lie. The house where he swore Natalie was buried, it hadn't even been built when she disappeared. Once again, he had played the Holloway family like pawns in his sick game. By June, he was indicted in the U.S. for wire fraud and extortion, a new criminal chapter in a story that had already dragged on for 5 years. But then came the twist no one could have scripted. On May 30th, 2010, 5 years to the very day Natalie vanished, 21-year-old business student Stephanie Flores Ramirez was found dead in a Lima, Peru hotel room registered under Vandersloot's name. This time there was no mystery, no endless trail of what-ifs. The evidence was there. Stephanie had been beaten, strangled, and robbed. Vandersloot confessed, coldly admitting he killed her because she looked through his laptop and found files connecting him to Natalie. It was rage, paranoia, and cruelty fused into one monstrous act. Vandersloot's arrest was swift. Captured in Chile, extradited to Peru, and paraded before the world, his confession was a grim confirmation of what many had suspected all along. This wasn't just a liar. This was a predator. In 2012, he pleaded guilty to Stephanie's murder and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Meanwhile, the Holloway family had to face the unthinkable. In June 2011, 6 years after Natalie disappeared, Dave Holloway went to court to declare his daughter legally dead. Beth opposed it at first. It was a mother's refusal to let go of hope. But by January 2012, a judge's ruling made it official. Natalee Holloway, who left for Aruba on a high school graduation trip, was gone. And yet, the cruelty of false leads didn't stop. A jawbone washed ashore in 2010 tested, but not Natalie's. Bones uncovered in 2017 by a private investigator and hyped in an Oxygen documentary, tested, but again, not Natalie's. Even more grotesque were the confessions of John Ludwig, a man who claimed he helped Vandersloot dig up and destroy Natalie's remains. His story was gruesome, his credibility shaky, and before he could ever be fully questioned, Ludwig was stabbed to death in 2018 during a botched kidnapping attempt. Another piece of the puzzle gone forever. By then, the story had stretched across continents, blended tragedy with media spectacle, and left the Holloways with a scar that would never close. Aruba, the Netherlands, Peru, courtrooms, caves, oceans, rumors, bones, lies. And through it all, one haunting truth remained. Natalee Holloway's fate was bound to a man whose cruelty left a trail of broken lives in his wake. The Natalee Holloway mystery is finally solved. For 18 long years, Beth Holloway carried the kind of pain that never let up, the unanswered questions, the false leads, the endless waiting. Then, in 2023, the silence finally shattered. On June 8th, Joran Vandersloot was flown out of Peru, where he had been serving a 28-year sentence for the brutal murder of Stephanie Flores, and handed over to U.S. authorities. He landed in Birmingham, Alabama, and for the first time since Natalie's disappearance, the man who had always hovered in the shadows of suspicion was standing in front of an American court. The charges weren't for murder, but for something darker in its own way: extortion and wire fraud. He had tried to bleed money from the Holloway family, offering fake details about where Natalie's body could be found in exchange for $250,000. At first, he pleaded not guilty, but just a few months later, on October 18th, the truth spilled out. In a proffer letter, Vandersloot finally admitted what Beth Holloway had always known in her bones. He was the one who killed Natalie. He confessed that after she rejected his advances, he flew into a violent rage, kicking her before smashing her head with a cinder block. Then, as if erasing a life could be done in silence, he dragged her body into the ocean and left it to disappear forever. Beth Holloway stood in court as the man who had taunted her for nearly 2 decades, feeding her false stories, granting cruel interviews, and twisting the knife of uncertainty, finally called himself what he had been all along: Natalie's killer. Facing reporters after the hearing, Beth didn't mince words. She told them it was over. Joran Vandersloot was no longer just the suspect. He was the murderer. But the ending came with its own cruel edge. Natalie's body would never be found. A judge had declared her legally dead back in 2012. But the finality hit differently this time. There would be no grave to visit, no remains to lay to rest, just the cold truth of what Vandersloot had done and the emptiness he left behind. In her victim impact statement, Beth Holloway laid bare the weight of those 18 years. She reminded him that his lies, his manipulations, his games had deepened her suffering beyond words. She wrote that the grief had rooted itself so deeply inside her that it lived in her soul. Vandersloot was sentenced in U.S. court, but the deal meant his punishment would run alongside the years he still owed Peru for killing Stephanie Flores. Justice, at least on paper, was done. But the real victory was the truth finally coming out. The mystery that haunted the Holloway family and the world had finally been solved. 18 years after Natalee Holloway vanished on a warm night in Aruba, her story closed in a courtroom in Alabama, not with the recovery of her body, not with the kind of closure most families pray for, but with a confession that confirmed the fear her mother had carried all along, that her daughter's life had been stolen in a moment of senseless brutality, and that the man responsible would finally live the rest of his days branded for what he truly was, a killer. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.